Hello, everyone. My name is Gitika Gorthy, and today I am very honored to be interviewing a very special space champion, Dr. Jennifer Fogarty. Dr. Fogarty is a director of the Applied Health and Extreme Environments Division at Sophic Synergistics. Sophic Synergistics is a human-centered design firm specializing in integrating the best practices associated with human factors and medical physiology into a business model. As director of the Applied Health and Extreme Environments Division, Dr. Fogarty will be focusing on developing and expanding the application of human health and performance innovations, including medical technologies used in remote health and remote medicine, telemedicine, and home healthcare. Dr. Fogarty has over 20 years experience in human physiology and extreme environments, and was most recently the NASA Human Research Program Chief Scientist. As Chief Scientist, she has led the development and oversight of an extensive research portfolio that addressed a diverse set of human system risks to enable human exploration of space. Before taking on a leadership role in the Human Research Program, Dr. Fogarty was the Translational Scientist for NASA Space and Clinical Research Program. Dr. Fogarty was a Translational Scientist for NASA Space and Clinical Operations Division in the Human Health and Performance Directorate. In this role, she facilitated project development and program interactions between the operational and research communities. She identified candidates for the transition to operations process to reduce risk and resource utilization with the overall goal of preserving astronaut health and performance during and after missions. On top of the amazing work she has and is doing, she is also on the editorial team for the Fundamentals of Aerospace Medicine 5th edition, where she regularly lectures on space physiology and human system risk management. As I mentioned, she has so many accomplishments and has done so much in specifically space medicine research. I'm so excited to be able to talk with her today and understand more about her space journey in a deeper level. Welcome, Dr. Fogarty. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your busy schedule to conduct this interview.
Thank you, Gitika. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and when I read about your work, I was really interested on how you got into space medicine and what your track was. But before we get into understanding your journey and how you really got into love space medicine, first I'd like to know more about your typical day. What do you currently do and how does it run?
Yeah, so I've undergone some recent employment change. I made a decision to leave NASA for a while, separate. I think there's always a great opportunity I will go back because I'm very passionate about the mission. But I wanted to step away to pursue some other things. So before I left, my day was very regimented. We, as a government organization, I think it's required to have a minimum of 6 hours of meetings a day. And I say that only half jokingly. I mean, there's just a lot of people we have to answer to, and being in the chief scientist role for the human research program, I both had to oversee all the people who worked for the program, all my scientists, and make sure I had good communication with them. And then we also had to talk what we call up and out, which was either to people above us, say at headquarters, or to people in the media or people in Congress. So there were a lot of customers, as we say, to make sure that they felt that they were well informed and really engaged, so that we understood what our mission was and what the best way to accomplish it. We also have a lot of collaborations with partners academically, other government agencies, internationally. So telecons can start at 5 in the morning sometimes, and sometimes they go till midnight because you're dealing with probably 20 different time zones when you start including Japan and Moscow and Australia. But it's really exciting work. But I decided to step away for a couple of years to really understand what it would take to move technology back and forth between industries and also apply it a little bit differently. So now my day has some similarities, but the pace is very different. And I have a lot more of what I was interested in developing, which is called autonomy. So I'm not so beholden to probably 150 people every day, but it's me in a small company. Again, it is a human-centered design firm, as you said, a lot of human factors engineering specialists that are there, which they really key in on some really important aspects of usability and safety, going back to my risk management background, which if you come up with a really good solution, if someone can't use it, it doesn't matter. So there's a lot of, I always say, if something fails for the right reason, that's okay, you learned from it. It didn't work, and you take those lessons learned and maybe you can apply it and make a difference, come back with a new version. But if it fails for the wrong reason, which means we didn't put enough time and effort into understanding how someone else could use it or in what forum they're using it. So when you talk about extreme environments, it was really important. So now it's still several meetings a day to make sure I'm connecting with my own company people and understand what's going on and if they need me. I'm growing my division. So I'm out looking for customers, which I never had to do before. I came from the funding side of things. I used to have the budget, and now I used to hand it out. You know, there were rules and reasons how it got done. Now I'm looking for people who are interested in partnering with me to fund the work I'm interested in doing, which I think has a bigger purpose. So that's a little change. So I'm making some phone calls and trying to understand how to use my network. I'm also trying to grow past aerospace. So I talk to people in a lot of different domains. People who are doing startups in medical technology, sometimes performance. There's a performance element to what I'm interested in, which means that at some point you're healthy, but we need you functioning in a specialized way. Like if you think elite athletes, like you're going to train and you're going to feed your body differently if you want to be an explosive, you know, sprint track star versus an endurance marathon versus a swimmer versus a weightlifter versus a baseball player versus a soccer player. So all of those subspecializations, the body is an amazing adaptable machine. And I think sometimes we forget how much it can change and respond. And it's not, measuring change is not always a bad thing. And we may get into this discussion about space medicine, that sometimes change seems scary. And we've had a couple of years of scary, you know, where we didn't have a lot of information to give us security, and we weren't sure where this journey with this pandemic was going to take us. And we're still not 100% sure, right? We're learning as we go. But then other parts of my day are actually doing things that I hadn't had the luxury of really doing for a long time, which was reading and writing. So when you're jammed up with a lot of meetings, I used to get a couple hours at night before I had to go home to my family and try to get my email read and responses and quickly go through things that I thought required a lot of critical thinking, where you got to have some quiet time and really concentrate. But now I use a portion of my day to do that, because I think I've really prioritized science communication and documenting my thoughts about where we need to go with respect to telemedicine, medicine in extreme environments, including space, and then bringing it back to Earth and figuring out how that could inform home healthcare, but just empowering people with their own data. I think knowledge is power. And I'm trying to find ways to both enable it and then to make sure that it's quality. What is out there evidence-based wise, and how do we keep growing that evidence base? And then when is it going to be ready to start develop a product that people can use and be informed about what the results mean? So my day is a little more relaxed, I have to say, and I'm enjoying it, but I think the pace is going to pick up pretty soon. I got some projects that people want to engage on, and we're going to be off doing some fun work soon.
Yeah, I'm really glad to know that you're able to, build in time for some of the things that you weren't able to earlier. And, your work sounds really interesting. So I'm just going to jump into the next question, which is, what is the most exciting research or project that you've worked on or are working on?
Yeah, to pick out one, you say it's like picking out your favorite child. Like they're so different and they're all amazing in their own way. I have to say, one of the areas, though, particularly in spaceflight, which I think actually has a lot of implications for Earth healthcare and technology, it was full spectrum, really offered all of the interesting, complicated, fascinating things. And that is called space-associated neuroocular syndrome. That was something we dealt with clearly in the International Space Station. I started with this project and this issue. So you start with, I think what sometimes gets misunderstood is, space medicine, we are building it now. When you think about some of the specialties that exist on Earth, when you go to a doctor, not that they're not always in a learning mode, like there's always some research component to medicine, things we didn't anticipate or know, but in the concept of space medicine, when you take a human body and you put it into an environment where it is no longer exposed to stressors and stimulus that it used to have, and primarily you think of gravity, it's a big one. But then we put it in a closed environment. So we're actually we have an artificial amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide because we can't completely scrub it. So nothing is Earth-like exactly. We try to get pretty close. So the body is busy adapting. And you say, well, why it's adapting? Is it staying healthy? And is it staying performance ready? So we're constantly surveilling the people in spaceflight to understand, are you maintaining your health and wellness physiologically, psychologically, emotionally? So a lot of components to pay attention to. But when we just do fundamental exams, like how are your eyes? You know, what's going on with your nose? How about your ears? Your ears are a big one, especially when it comes to barotrauma, because we put people outside the vehicle in the EVA suit and we change the pressure. So you're always looking at all the body systems that they do on Earth. So along the way, when we were looking at people's eyes, because eyes tell you obviously about your vision, but they're also connected to the brain and they're in your head. So they are a direct impact when things happen inside your cranium, inside that hard vault of your skull. And so we know a lot of signs and symptoms can come out in the eye. So along the way, we were able to measure the back of the eye, things that were going on in different parts of the anatomy. And way back, way back, about 15 years ago, we started to pick up some changes in some of the long duration astronauts that were not typical. Like I'm going to try to be careful with my word choice. And so as they were not typical, now in aerospace, we fly very few people compared to all the people that go to the doctor on Earth, right? So if you find something in a given individual, you can't make the assumption applies to everybody, right? So we started looking very deeply at individuals and said, well, what's going on here? Was this just them? And could this have happened on Earth if they didn't fly? And if it is a result of being in spaceflight, what aspect of spaceflight could have induced this change to occur? And is this change positive, negative, or neutral, right? And in doctors' terms, is it actionable? Does this test, like say if you do a fundoscope test on an eye and you look at the back of the eye, is there a good positive predictive value? If you do, it's called optical coherence tomography, and you actually look at the back of the eye, but in a deeper part of the tissue, and you're mapping what's called the choroid in the retina, is that positive predictive? Do I know what to do with that data if I get it? And the answer is maybe. So anyway, it showed some changes in the back of the eye. It showed a swelling of the back of the eye, which is not normal and it's not age related. So that starts to tell you, well, maybe something different was happening and that we need to be concerned about it. So now we started checking all astronauts pre, in, and post flight. We had to fly new technology to give us insights into the eye that we had not been able to measure before. So we flew a fundoscope, we flew a device called OCT, optical coherence tomographer. And you know, there's a whole army of people who had to get involved to figure out not only how do you launch it and make sure that it's still usable when it arrives at the International Space Station, because launch can be a pretty violent experience, but that you could mount it, that the data moved, that it was power, you know, there's every detail you could imagine. But then you had to deal with the human data. You know, what was going on with someone's eye? How was their vision changing over time? And did the change in their eye represent a change to their brain? Was there something we didn't understand that we couldn't easily image? And it is very challenging to image the brain during spaceflight. We do MRIs and CT scans before the mission and after the mission, but there's a whole gap in time where we're not able to understand what's really happening to the brain other than what the people can tell us if we were to do, say, cognitive testing. So you're really using the eye as the window and trying to understand, is it just an eye problem or is it the eye representing an issue going on with the brain? And we're still working through that. We work with experts from almost every field you could imagine. Everyone has something to bring to bear: vascular specialists, neurosurgeons, neuro-ophthalmologists, neurologists, people who ophthalmologists who specialize in a variety of diseases of the eye. We work with geneticists, medical geneticists, to understand if there's some genetic predisposition to the problem. So it keeps on going on and on in terms of, you're just seeking as much data as possible, and you're trying to synthesize it and understand what symptoms are related to each other and which ones are independent, and how much is about a person versus about the environment inducing it on the human in general. So that was one of the most comprehensive issues. And to me, it really represented spaceflight physiology. The body is a system of systems. We saw kind of things come together in such a way that it manifested in the eye, that it represented a lot of those systems were taken kind of to a limit, and then they expressed a change. So a lot of this was kind of bubbling up in the background, but it was below the level of detection. And so people come and say, well, why did it take us so long? Well, it took us so long because we didn't fly long duration space flight until after we had the International Space Station. So this was not a problem we would have seen during any of the other programs, except for, and interestingly enough, this is where knowing your history is very important, that this was actually detected in a form of fundoscopy that was done by the Russian Space Agency on cosmonauts who were on Mir. And it was in a paper that was done by psychologists who happened to be imaging the eye, and it was hidden, more or less, like hidden in plain sight. It's a paper that was kind of obscure, and it was one of our Russian colleagues who called it to our attention. One of our other colleagues who works for us had it translated, and we've started a different relationship with our colleagues internationally, because at first people were very resistant. They didn't think it was happening in other people, or, there was a lot of it gets in your way that if you don't go looking for a problem, it must not exist. So we were encouraging people to screen their astronauts more, their cosmonauts more, if we weren't responsible for them. And ultimately that paper helped shed some light that it really has to do with duration of spaceflight and exposure, probably to microgravity is the predominant issue. But it's a very interesting problem, and it's one of those things that we really need to fully characterize it and understand what risk it represents, and actually build some countermeasures before we could do something like a Mars mission and feel confident that we were doing the right thing for the people who are going.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, when we're in the future, when we're trying to go into commercialization of space and we're sending, the general public to go up to space. I mean, right now, the best of the best, the most fit astronauts who exercise in space are being sent. And so being able to understand the issues they're facing in space, but also how that can impact regular citizens, diverse number of citizens going into space, and the different conditions that they could potentially face and how we could solve that, I think is really important. So, I'm really glad that you were able to share that research. And so I'm curious, how did you get into space or aerospace medicine? Because it's a very unique, career choice. I feel like there's not a lot that I meet out there who studied medicine or studied in the research area of science and are like, oh, I'm going to go into space medicine. So how did you find and go into that unique career path?
Yeah, and it was a unique opportunity. So,
Yeah.
like a lot of people, I had some concepts of where I wanted to go from a researcher perspective, but not a very tight, narrow field. So for me, what I struggled with during my PhD work really was, and I will share with you something that along your way, I would say, like, I don't have a regret, but if there was something I were to do differently, and part of it is being kind of first generation college material from a family, was I would have done an MD PhD, a joint program.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, I would have worked a little harder at understanding and getting into a joint program. But I did my PhD in a medical college, which afforded me kind of the environment I wanted. And I specialized, I did 2 years of medical school, essentially the coursework, and then I just stuck with research. While a lot of my colleagues who went off and could be doing MD PhDs, and then there were the MDs who went off and did their clinical rotations, but they all kind of rotated through different labs. So it had aspects of both. I loved the applied nature of it. Like the so what matters to me. It's very motivating to understand, and that's where that translational scientist job came in, was let's move this stuff into a paradigm where it becomes usable, or at least people understand its utilization. I think there's a big gap. Sometimes things are waiting there to be used, they're just misunderstood, or there's no light on it, you know, it hasn't been communicated. So there's lots of obstacles to why solutions haven't come forward. And so, and again, some are good and right, they're not appropriate, and some are just that we don't know about them. They're kind of orphan technologies or orphan solutions. So while I was doing my PhD, I was working in a cardiovascular disease model. I gave talks, and all of my work was going to the American Heart Association. So it was very well accepted the work I was doing was clinically relevant. It could easily move into the human domain, which really satisfied that need for me in terms of doing research, but understanding its application. I used to get a little confused when you dig deep, 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 deep down, like when we were getting to like sequencing of a receptor, like the so what, if I didn't pop back up and kind of understand the context of what I was doing, I like get lost in the weeds. And I think, you know, generalizable knowledge is amazing, but it's all out there. But the scientists, to some extent, still bear some responsibility to help other people understand what it means. What are its potential implications and how you might use that information. So I'm one of those hunters, and I like to be kind of the detective. So the place I actually did my laboratory work, you know, you're like in a very large campus, 54,000 students, tons of laboratories and buildings. I had amazing access to all these things, and a large animal clinic, and anything you could imagine that is done on humans, we were capable of doing. But it also is kind of like, wow, the possibilities are limitless. But I had connected with a group in the kinesiology department because I myself am very interested in physical fitness and athletic exposures and athletic performance. And I was working more from the concept of using exercise to beat cardiovascular disease and kind of drive a natural bypass system, which you can do, believe it or not, and people do it all the time. It's not their favorite because you have to eat right and you have to exercise all the time.
Yeah.
But you can actually grow blood vessels to go around a blockage, right? So that was my work, and I was over in the kinesiology department with all the people who were just very applied, right? Every day they worked with humans, and they were trying to figure out how to drive the humans faster, harder, you know, excel more, whatever sport they were working on. Well, one of our investigators who was on my committee actually had a grant with NASA that was flying on a space shuttle mission. And I had done a lot of good work in his lab. He saw me, you know, as a student, and he asked me to go with him on to Kennedy and support the mission real time. So I joined his team when I finished my PhD and was in a postdoctoral position. And I had known about aerospace, and I have a brother who's a high performance jet pilot. I'm very interested in kind of the physical fitness that was required to do extreme things and how you optimize your physical state to accomplish a function. And I'll have to look it up to you and email to you so your audience has it, but it was a book written by a woman who climbed Mount Everest, and she tried several times and failed. And she was trying to figure out what it was about her abilities, because she trained so hard that she couldn't finish the climb. She couldn't summit. And what it turned out was she lacked body fat. She was so highly trained, and she had tuned her body so much for climbing, but you have to accommodate the fact that you're going into a low oxygen, very cold environment. And her metabolism was making it so that she was running out of energy and couldn't finish the climbs. And so she had to, and sometimes that's really hard aesthetically when you're trying to understand your own body and look at it. She had to put on body fat to be able to summit Mount Everest. And it's this dichotomy sometimes, right, of what you're trying to achieve, that you can be optimized for one environment, but very much not optimized for another, which I think is what you're getting at with especially commercial space, that humans run a spectrum of health, and there's lots of normal, actually, much broader selection. You know, when you talk about diversity, we tend to run into this, like if we measure something and it's different than what this other standard was, well, this standard might have been created on a very narrow population. And now medicine is starting to understand the spectrum of what might actually be normal for you, which speaks to what I think is the right target, which is personalized medicine. Sometimes a change for you can result in a negative outcome, even though the numbers look like they should be normal. And so medicine is getting smarter about not only doing big data, but deep data, which is lots of data on an individual. So what makes crew members vulnerable, and maybe a person who might fly in space vulnerable, is really important to know, and not just say that it's about selection criteria, about being the fittest, because I'm not so sure we know what the fittest is. And the European Space Agency right now has a selection out for astronauts, and they're looking for those who even have physical disabilities, because in space, those disabilities may not matter, right? So it's about being healthy and cognitively functional and well educated and technically proficient. So while I was on this space shuttle mission and supporting that, I really understood my place potentially at NASA, which was new to me. I didn't think we visited Johnson Space Center because I was here in Texas doing my graduate work. And I thought, wow, it would be really amazing, like this far off kind of fantasy for me. But when I did that space shuttle mission, and again, it was just this really fortuitous connection to an advisor on my committee who got a grant because he worked in, vascular science in an animal model. And he liked the work I did, and he invited me to join, and it opened up my eyes to a whole new possibility. So when I was ready to transition out of a postdoc, I started talking to folks about where my place could be, and I was able to get a job with one of the contractors, and that job allowed me to see the breadth of what was going on in the Human Health and Performance Directorate. And then I started to understand how I could add value and where my expertise and kind of how I look at science and how I look at physiology and how I look at spaceflight all come together. So it was really quite a unique opportunity that I just took advantage of, and kind of a leap of faith.
Yeah, I think space medicine is a sector that not many, medical professionals realize has so much scope, and it's so directly related to everything that here happens on Earth. So I think I'm very glad that you were able to find that through an advisor and, really discover your passion. And you mentioned many times translational medicine, and, particularly, I'm very interested in how artificial intelligence is now starting to be more, deeply and heavily involved in medical innovations. Especially in space. Like, for example, I was talking with someone who's mentioning they're developing this product to allow astronauts to not have to make critical decisions on the spot, but rather a program, like a robot, would make the decisions for them. Because under mental stress, we don't know if astronauts could make the best decisions during like certain critical, dangerous situations. So, what is your take on using artificial intelligence in like medical innovations?
Yeah, and it can be a controversial topic for sure, artificial intelligence and machine learning. But I think where my perspective on them, and the group I was working with in the human research program, was exploration medical capabilities. So they're in charge of developing the medical system of the future. And to be honest, we're trying to get away, and the world at large should get away of thinking like the domain, is stovepiped over here in terms of medical. Medical is involved with everything you do. All the choices you make interface with it. The decisions that are made to treat you interface with what you do. I mean, it's a web of things. So we kind of you have to manage it so you can be informed and make decisions and do work. But you can't ignore the fact that the interrelatedness of your psychological and emotional well-being play a role in your physical health. Like I think you were just saying, like the psychological stress of a mission, of the isolation and confinement, will influence how your body's functioning, and we can learn a lot about cortisol levels and other markers of stress, but ultimately over time those have a factor in things like cardiovascular disease, and that's going to be true for the astronauts, and then they have other stressors on top of it. So we talk about whether it's going to be additive or that word synergistic. Are they going to multiply together, and could this disease state emerge faster, or could it be more serious given that you've compounded the stressors simultaneously? So, in space flight and space medicine, that translatability is hugely important. And you're right, the amount of information that an individual has to synthesize and turn around into informing a decision can be overwhelming. And not every individual is going to come from a background where they're able to take it all in, instantaneously. If you've spent decades like myself, I can ingest medical information much more rapidly than someone who is specialized in planetary science. but I don't understand anything. Like I have to go back to, I'm like, it's going to take me at least 2 years just to understand lingo from another discipline when I sit down at a conference. I'm just overwhelmed by kind of the terminology and their interrelatedness, and I don't have all the history. So my ability to do work in their domain is much slower, and I'm not going to be as sharp and as correct making decisions. So that's like a long lead in to say that artificial intelligence to me has a lot to do with what I call decision support. Now, there is potential that there are levels of decision making that make sense, that if the data that's brought in, it's kind of an equation, right? If it's assessing the health of a vehicle system, let's do a real life kind of goofy example, but a real one, which is the human waste management system breaks down a lot, right? Because it's used a lot. It's just like in your home, and you don't want human waste being loose in your house, no less a spaceflight vehicle. So fixing the toilet is a priority, and and it has to undergo repairs because of how often it's used, right? So this is all planned in. But wouldn't it be way better in terms of the value of someone's time that if it was able to monitor itself and pull in, like, how is the vacuum? Are there any leaks? Are the parts, how wearable are the parts? And you talk about like life cycle, if something has to turn or, switches have to be flipped. The machine could be assessing all those things and give the crew information. And hopefully someday we'll have robots that, can self-repair the toilet, because that is not a good use of an astronaut time, but they're going to need the toilet. So it's a critical piece of hardware. So it has those two components to it, right? I'd rather they were off doing other meaningful work like science experiment or astronomy or whatever it is they're charged to do during exploration, and not fixing the toilet. But the fact is the toilet has to get fixed. So I think machine learning, artificial intelligence can be managed so that it's doing low level tasks that don't require the human to get involved, and can offload the human from work that they don't necessarily have to do. There's probably a threshold where it makes sense to have artificial intelligence not make the decision for the human, but inform the human's decision. And that's where I think it becomes most useful medically. That there's always an element of, because even like IBM Watson and things of that nature, which are incredibly powerful, can suck in all this information and kind of do a lot of algorithms to kind of sort through it. It misses the human component, each time. And there is an element that, someone's experience and someone's understanding of the current state, the context of the scenario, has a certain intangible nature to it, that it's really important to keep a human in the loop and be the end decider. But I think cutting down on what their decisions are and doing kind of that differential when it's comparing, if you're giving it blood, say results from a blood analysis, a urine analysis, or, OCT or fundoscopy or whatever it happens to be, your data, your biomedical data, that the algorithms can run and churn all the calculations that say, well, what's the evidence for this compared to the evidence for that? And bring up kind of a selection of what should happen next. And then the human takes that down selected set and says, okay, based on what I'm seeing here, I think these things are the right way to go, but I know I have some alternatives. That's been my approach to how we started to integrate artificial intelligence, is that we use the phrase decision support for the humans, for the medical system and the performance system, because some of it has to do with verbally what the person is conveying to you. So test results can say normal, 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 and the person still will tell you, I don't feel well. And then they say, I don't feel when I bend over. And in spaceflight, that doesn't exist, but it could be with any activity, like when I go behind a rack and I have to work for an hour, I don't feel well. Well, that is actually a real scenario, because CO2, carbon dioxide that you exhale, tends to bubble in microgravity. And when you go behind something like we call a rack, when a door opens and you got to go in and fix something, you're in a more confined environment and there's less airflow. So we've actually had that scenario where an hour after someone's done a lot of work, when they've been in a more confined area, that they got a headache and didn't feel well. Well, their blood work isn't going to show you anything. Their urine isn't going to show you anything. but they're telling you something and you have to believe them and you have to manage it. And then you got to do your little detective work and say, well, if all these things are normal and you still don't feel well, where were you recently? What were you doing recently? And kind of probe that. So I think artificial intelligence and machine learning definitely have a place, because not everyone can't know everything. And right now, journal articles and evidence is produced at a rate that the best of the best can't keep up. So you're constantly looking for ways to synthesize data and still be a critical thinker and a skeptic about what you're receiving, I think. And then you say, okay, well, now I'm going to down select to these 3 papers and I'm going to go concentrate on them. And then I'll, branch out once I decide what my next, where are those clues taking me? I think the astronauts are brilliant. Even the commercial ones, anyone motivated to go to space flight and shows that passion. There's all kinds of brilliant, it's not just about PhDs. Brilliance comes in many different forms, and those people need to be engaged and they need to be pulled on, as invested parties in this. They're the ones who are going to be the ones most vulnerable to making a bad decision. And so they need to be key in that, but they need to have the decision support to do the best job.
Yeah, that 100% makes sense. And I've also been really curious not only on the aspect of decision making, but maybe in another conversation we could really talk about how AI can also be used in monitoring astronaut health.
Yeah.
And like seeing how if there's certain vital signs that suddenly drop, and how programming could help without having a flight surgeon on board do telemedicine. And I think it would be a very cool topic to really discuss further, because I believe AI has such a big future. And
that's a phenomenal example. And I think you're correct in that we have to do medicine for exploration very different than we do medicine today, even on the International Space Station, and embrace autonomy and allowing the crew information and real-time support. And I think unobtrusive monitoring and really keying in on some key like biomedical markers that say a change has happened and you need to be alerted to it, and ask a bunch of questions about if then, and then offering up, well, maybe you should sleep more, maybe you should take different actions. So I think telemedicine will look different in the future, but all of that can come back to earth and I think help us optimize telemedicine for us. Because instead of traveling places or going into offices, we can be more in tune with what's going on with our own bodies and our own health to communicate better to people who can help take care of us. So I really appreciate that perspective, and it's very, very keen that you picked up on that.
Thank you. And now that we're able to understand more of your space medicine research and the future of space, which really is exciting, I'd like to know more about your journey. You obviously got into space medicine. So what were some obstacles, if you had any, on your journey, and how did you overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, obstacles are interesting. So I spent some time doing open innovation and crowdsourcing with one of my mentors who really opened up opportunities for me at NASA. His name is Dr. Jeff Davis. He's the lead editor on the Fundamentals of Aerospace Medicine, he definitely from the 4th and 5th edition. And then he was junior editor on the 3rd. He goes back decades. He's a very accomplished flight surgeon. And he's a very altruistic human, right? He's always out there trying to engage people, particularly young women. And he saw that, and I've run into actually another doctor, Dr. Michael Duncan, who has passed away. He was another gentleman who, if I had obstacles in my career, if I sat and talked to either one of them, they were very good about giving me some advice to figure out if it was a real obstacle, a real barrier, or if it was kind of one of these cultural phenomenons, which doesn't make it any less real in the sense that it might be stopping you, but your approach to resolving it is very different. So the first thing is to differentiate, like, is it a real barrier in terms of, is it a legal one? Is it a physical one? And that's where you're like, I worked in a warehouse. So you're talking about my journey. I grew up in New Jersey, South Jersey. I have 3 brothers. My parents were were married until they both passed away in 2018. So, you know, an intact family, very loving, but, you know, modest. We were middle class, very education focused. Like my parents were, you're gonna accomplish these goals. Me and my brothers were very driven, I have to say. Like there's an intrinsic nature to it. And one of my brothers is a little bit more artsy and different, you know, but I have appreciation for all of it. He's incredibly well read, and he really challenges my thinking about things at all times. So I seek out differences. And also I had a fabulous grandmother, my mom's mom. She was a phenomenal woman who lost her husband in 1954, raised 3 kids in New York City. She was a Rosie the Riveter during World War II. I mean, just an unstoppable force of nature, this woman. And her perspective, which really influenced me, because I used to spend summers with her. So my mom would send me up to New York City to live with her to get a break from my 3 brothers. And so anyway, she was incredibly influential about, and I phrase it as this, like, I don't accept your no. Like I was told no a lot, but I just would look at people like, I don't understand that. Like it didn't make sense to me. And so I'd be like, well, okay, well, you're not the person for me. You know, I will go around you. I'll find another option. And sometimes people are in a position of authority where even though their no is not a legal no, it's enough of a no that you're not going to enter their domain, right? When you say, I had this in college, let's say, and for certain departments, it was clear that maybe that person didn't believe that maybe women in general didn't have the capability to do certain things. And I was like, I felt like I have a lot of dogs and they kind of tilt their head like, what are you saying? I don't understand. It does not compute. And so I appreciated their position, and I wasn't, you know, hitting something head on sometimes is not the best approach. So you gotta be a little more strategic. And that was like, you know, work smarter, not harder. And I found alternatives. Now, you know, is it ideal? No, but I think now that I'm in a position of authority and have been in a position of authority, it is my job to dismantle the cultural things. You know, it is my job to stand up and do communication and let folks know that what they used to think and why they used to think it was not accurate. And they needed different experiences. So the few times I have run into people who didn't think I could do a job, maybe, and I would say I would try not to presuppose it was they thought because I was a woman. I'll give them I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But the point was, I will show you what a job I can do, and maybe that will change your mind, and you'll stop, you know, typing all of us as not capable. So, you know, I had women. You know, we always say we stand on the shoulders of giants. There's many women clearly in the space industry who have been those giants and advocated for other women, which is huge. Sometimes there's been patterns of behavior where women might get into positions of authority and maybe not taken on that role as an advocate for other women. And I think that's a waste and that's a shame, but I don't judge them because I'm sure they had a hard path. But I know what my job is or what I think it is. And, you know, again, you will run into obstacles for all kinds of different reasons, and it's your job to get around them. And you go to the people who are your advocates. And I think it is key to find some advocates and allies who can help guide you, give you alternatives, and actually help you manage yourself, because it can be very emotional when it happens. And when you let emotions lead you, you might not be making the best decisions. You may be, but you don't know. I think it's always good to have someone who can help quiet you, and you can get kind of centered about an issue and think a little bit more logically and think about, okay, what's my strategy now? How do I make this happen? Given that that no was given to me, what are my alternatives? And I think it leads to an interesting life and a healthier one, because if you're always battling headfirst into things and trying to confront conflict with conflict, you spend a lot of time and energy on the fight and not making progress. And I believe I've changed more minds and possibly hearts by tempering my response and led through action and not so much words. But it's been a journey for sure. And when you're still going to run into it because we're human. But it's a matter of just accepting it and knowing that you are making a difference as you pursue you know, education and career paths and your passion, and wanting to make sure that you leave the world a better place than you found it.
That is so inspirational. I mean, thank you first of all for sharing that. I think a lot of women, not just women, but any minorities in general, especially in the space industry, there's this huge stereotype. I feel like, there's these old, males who are in the space industry, but, we're starting to change that. I see more diversity, I see more inclusivity. And, really a big part of starting the Space Champion interview series is really to, highlight diverse space champions and show kids out there that you don't have to look like someone or be like someone or ever have a feeling of an imposter syndrome. I know I talked with many professionals in the industry who felt like maybe I'm not good enough because of a certain of how they were born. And so I feel like always showing that and proving people wrong through actions instead of just words, I think is really powerful. And thank you so much for sharing that. And so that kind of leads me to my last question to wrap up the interview, which is what advice, which you've already shared a few pieces of it, do you have for young people regarding their pursuit of a passion in the STEM field or specifically the space industry, something that you wish you knew when you were like a younger student?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree with you that there's so much about, that's going to be unique to each individual, and I try to be careful. Like I haven't lived some of the heartache that a lot of people did. I think, I did some challenging things for sure, but when I look back, I was like, it was not. People were very gracious on the whole and very accepting, and that's not what everybody walks into. So I want to be respectful of how different their experiences could be. But I think going back to when you go through some challenging opportunities or events, and you're seeking like to make progress, and you want to get into a field that maybe doesn't have a lot of people like you, and there's going to be some resistance. One is always a self-check. How much am I bringing? How much negativity am I bringing, thinking you're already making those comments about me? Just kind of, can you shut that part down and try to really key in on what's going on from them? Like instead, I think there's a little projection sometimes. You were talking like even imposter syndrome and not feeling adequate, like I'm faking it. There was a good show on for years, The Pretender or something. And some days you feel like you are pretending, like, do I belong here? I remember the first time I stood on a stage in front of 1,000 people to give a talk at the International Space Station conference. Woo, that's a something, you walk out there and you're like, okay, people, I gotta go, show them, because there's people who are going to depend on me, who are out there to see that if I can do it, they can do it. And I want anyone to believe that. There are examples. They may not be in your exact field, but I think I just try to be careful that I'm not self-limiting by what I think other people are thinking. Like, how about we actually ask them, like, and see if you can get them to tell you what's going on. Anyway, it can be a little challenging. The thing is that I've heard it, I think, because I did listen to some of your other interviews, which were spectacular, was you are going to walk into things where people don't look like you, and you're going to have to take that deep breath, and your actions are going to have to speak louder than any words you could say. And I think you do try to find those advocates and allies to work with you. I heard a quote recently. Her name is Dr. Cheryl Nickerson. She's at Arizona State University. She's a remarkable woman, force of nature researcher, space flight, human. She's in microbial. I mean, she's just, and if you ever get to see her talk, she's just fabulous. But her quote, and I'm not sure if she got it from somebody, but she said it, so I want to attribute it to her, was, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's really speaks to, I have done nothing alone. I have always done it with people, with collaborators, people I didn't even realize till afterward how much I depended on just stopping in their office and decompressing. Them allowing me to decompress. They didn't even have to say a word. I just felt safe enough there to let go of some things that if I carried them into my next meeting or interaction, I might not have done as well. So, whether it be a family member who allows you that opportunity, a colleague, again, like an advisor, an advocate, a trusted person, you're going to need some people around you. Going it alone is not only lonely, but how do you know how to have the best judgment about a situation if you've never been in one? So I've really leaned pretty heavily as I reflect back. As the older I get, the smarter sort of I think I realize what I don't know. That's what I'm getting smarter at. That those people have been invaluable, and I've been lucky enough to have them in different ways and forms throughout my academic career and now my professional career. And I still go back and I write little thank you notes when I think of it, when something dawned on me, like, that's right. The only reason I know this or went that far was because that person helped guide me in some way, shape, or form. And sometimes it's not about telling you to do something, it's about asking you a key question to help you understand what your passions are and when you're ready for a change. So again, I said I went through a very dramatic change recently, and I got some questions because who would leave NASA? What? It's
Yeah.
that seems kind of nutty. And you know what? It is a little nutty, but I was offered an opportunity to do something that was, I thought, going to provide growth for me. And was it hard? Yeah, it was certainly hard for many reasons. And I still talk to many of the people, and they're struggling a little bit without me. And that's not, I don't mean to be too egotistical, but it was a big shift for them. But it's one of those where, in order for me to lead better, I had to go learn some different skills. And I think any time in our lives where we recognize what it is we need and we ask for the time to go do that, that's important too. It's an ever-changing environment. This pandemic has, I think, heightened our awareness about things that we value. And it also heightened our awareness about how confusing things can get when you don't have good leadership. And I think leadership across the board in our country, in our world, we're going to look to people like yourself to continue to play that role. And it requires a lot of people for you to rely on, because it's hard. It's a really hard thing to do and put yourself out there. Even doing these interviews like with you, every opportunity you take to speak out publicly is an opportunity for someone to give you feedback. And you made yourself very vulnerable, and you have to be very brave to become that vulnerable. But that's the only way we're going to really drive change. And I think your point of diversity and minority inclusion is so important, because so many misunderstandings and misleading impressions of what people are capable of have been so pervasive, that if those of us who are in positions where we can make decisions to include more people don't happen, it's just going to perpetuate what we have now, which is wrong. And so it's hard, but it's important, and it's the right thing to do. So, I think there's lots of right answers, and you got to dig deep about, what your heart and soul tell you to do, and what is your integrity. So anything I put my name on, anything I engage in, if I don't think it aligns with me and my integrity, I politely decline. But after watching you and what you do, I think I haven't seen anything as enlightening and more important about how you're probing, experts in the field of diverse backgrounds and trying to highlight it to people who need to see it. So congratulations, Gitika.
Thank you so much for your kind words. They mean so much, coming from an amazing, inspirational woman like yourself, and being able to hear your advice about, first off, having a support system, finding a community where you can rely on, whether it be for mental breaks or, career support, and always making those decisions to grow yourself as an individual, as, along with that community, is very important and vital. So, thank you so much for the amazing advice. I think we all got another inspirational story. And it really, I'm sure there's, other girls listening, anyone else, they'll understand that anything is possible. And, I want to thank you, Dr. Fogarty, for taking some time to share your insight in space medicine as well as your journey, because it was truly motivational to hear.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It was really a fabulous way to spend an hour with you. And I look forward to part 2. We can do a deep technical dive next time.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.